Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our distinguished speaker has now arrived, hot foot from his... Now I will introduce Peter Jenkins. I may say that Peter Jenkins is here because a few months ago there was a TV programme, BBC TV, on Sunday morning called The Big Question, and it was filmed in York, and Jane Venables was a member of the audience, and Peter was one of the speakers at it. Jane was very impressed by what Peter said. My wife and I, watching at home, were very impressed. Jane had the very good idea of going up afterwards and making herself known to him, and the result is, through Peter's great kindness, he's here tonight. I'll just explain a little bit about him. He's okay is what I'm going to say. He's a retired diplomat with a varied 33-year career in Washington, in Paris, in Brasilia, Geneva, and finally in Vienna. And all that may explain why he's also a linguist, fluent in French, German, and Portuguese. In Paris, he worked on the European single market, as it was then known, and in Geneva, he worked with the World Trade Organization. What probably interests us most is his final posting in Vienna, where from 2001 to 2006, he was the British ambassador to the UN and to the International Atomic Energy Agency. I'll refer to that further as the IAEA, and that's the body which supervises the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty on behalf of the United Nations. And when he was part of that body, apart from prominent involvement in some very important conferences, he focused on the Iranian nuclear issue, and he prepared several resolutions on Iran's nuclear program for the IAEA Board of Governors. Now, since leaving the diplomatic service, he's become a member of a group called ADRG Ambassadors, where ADR stands, I think, for Alternative Dispute Resolution. This is a group of former British ambassadors who work together to offer strategic advice, dispute resolution and mediation, and in Peter's case especially with the UN and the IAEA. But he's also involved with various bodies promoting clean and renewable energy, and he's a consultant, writer, lecturer and broadcaster within the last half hour on economic, nuclear and energy problems. I haven't been able to discover what he does in his spare time. I presume you'd like to speak for a time, and then you're prepared to answer questions. Of course. Yes. So we'll follow that normal course. Peter will speak first, and then he will kindly face our questions. And when we come to questions, I'll say a couple of things more. Thank you very much, please, Peter.
Will you mind if I remain seated?
No,
may I
no,
remain seated?
No, I got up. Thank you very much.
And may I thank you for your kindness in inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be with you, and an honour to be invited to speak to you all. And I'm sorry that I am a little bit late. I thought this programme was going out live, but it turned out they were recording it, and therefore they didn't scruple about running over longer than they said they would. I may talk to you for about half an hour. I hope that won't be too long and won't test your patience. Normally when I get invited to speak on Iran, I'm told I've only got 10 minutes. And it's deeply frustrating because there's so much that should be said, or needs to be said really, to explain what is quite a complex situation. On the other hand, none of us like being bored, so stick your hands up if you're getting bored. But I'll try not to bore you. I'm going to start by mentioning some significant dates on the path that has taken us to where we are now, and then I will describe where we are and maybe look a little bit into the future in as much as one can. And I think as far as looking into the future is concerned, I can, as of today, be relatively reassuring. But that doesn't mean that I'll be able to be reassuring in 6 months' time, unfortunately. I think the story really starts in 1970, which is when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which John has just referred, came into force. Iran in those days was under the Shah. Iran had played a prominent part in negotiating this treaty, and Iran was one of the first parties to this treaty. Absolutely crucial to this treaty, at the heart of it really, is a trade-off. The treaty says that people can use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, provided all the nuclear material in their possession is submitted to the constant monitoring and control of the IAEA, the IAEA safeguard system as it's called. There is another trade-off, and that basically says that all the states that didn't have nuclear weapons in 1970 will accept the UK, US, France, left out China and Russia continuing to have nuclear weapons, provided they provided they move steadily, if you like, in the direction of getting rid of their nuclear weapons. I'm afraid a lot of people feel they haven't moved as steadily as they should have done, but that's another topic for another day. I'm more concerned with the first trade-off between having new technology and placing all your material under safeguard. In 1975, the Shah decided that Iran would start building nuclear reactors so as to use less of its oil and gas for its own domestic purposes and have more to export because it earned good money from exporting. In 1979, the revolution occurred in Iran, and 9 months after the revolution, a group of students took a group of American diplomats hostage, and many of you will probably remember that that hostage crisis lasted about 440 days. The Americans were finally released an hour before or an hour after, I can't remember which, President Reagan took over from President Carter. That crisis almost certainly cost President Carter a second term, but it also left a very, very sour and angry and bitter taste in American mouths because they felt they'd been humiliated by this kind of upstart regime. In 1980, Saddam Hussein went to war with Iran, a very, very horrid war in which hundreds of thousands of Iranians lost their lives. In the middle of the 1980s, Iranians learnt that Saddam Hussein was working to produce enriched uranium using centrifuge machines so that he would be able to have nuclear weapons. In 1987, we didn't know this at the time, but we know it now, in 1987 the Supreme Leader of Iran authorized his own armed forces to embark on an Iranian military program with a view to acquiring nuclear weapons. One assumes that he did so because he was rather scared of what was going on next door under Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In 1992, yes, it wasn't really very apparent at the time, but it's certainly apparent now that in 1992 an incoming Israeli government, a leftish government, the Labour Party, worried that during the First Gulf War Israel had been a bit of a liability to the United States. After all, it was the target of Iraqi missile attacks and wasn't able to help, because if it had participated in the recapture of Kuwait, that would have driven all the Arab forces that were supporting the American and Allied operation, it would have driven them into the other camp. So Israel had to stay on the sidelines and was a target, and therefore, in effect, was a bit of a liability. So that was one thing that worried them. Another thing that worried them was that the Cold War was over, so the Americans no longer had to fear Soviet threats, if you like, in the Middle East. Hitherto, Israel had been seen as America's great bulwark against Soviet expansion in that part of the world. And so the I've lost the thought, but never mind. The Israelis started casting about for ways in which they could enhance their value to the United States. And so, whereas for the 13 years since the revolution, they had been trying to cultivate the Iranian government, they previously had very good relations under the Shah. But they continued trying to rebuild that relationship for 13 years under the Islamic Republic, even though Ayatollah Khomeini and his successor were frequently saying in public the most terrible things about Israel and Israel's right to exist and so on. But the Israelis allowed that to flow like water off a duck's back. But suddenly in 1992, realizing that they needed to conjure up a new threat to the West in that part of the world, they turned against Iran. And they started demonizing Iran's leaders as evil fanatics. And they started claiming that Iran was everywhere threatening, if you like, Western interests in the region. In 1995, the Iranians decided to split their nuclear program in two. The military hadn't got very far over the previous 8 years. So what the leaders decided was that the military would continue to dabble in the kind of technology that you would need to actually build nuclear weapons, but the business of producing the raw material for those weapons, which is highly enriched uranium, that would be handed over to a civilian atomic energy authority, which would also set about trying to complete the first of the reactors that was launched under the Shah, construction of which came to a halt immediately after the revolution. Then in 2002, a group of exiles, they were, I hope I'm not boring you, but when the revolution first took place in 1979, there were basically two factions. There was the Islamic faction, the religious faction, and there was a leftist faction, sort of Marxists, Trotskyists, extreme socialists, revolutionaries, if you like, of a rather familiar kind to us here in Europe. And those two factions fought bitterly for a couple of years to see who would end up on top. And as we know, of course, in the end it was the religious element that ended up on top, and the leftists had to go into exile. But not content with having been defeated, they set up a terrorist organization called the MEK, and over the years, ever since, the last 30 years, they've been responsible for a good number of assassinations and bombings and so on inside Iran. Almost certainly these assassinations of Iranian scientists that you've read about in the last 2 or 3 years have been carried out by members of the MEK at the prompting of Israel. Anyway, get back to the thread of my story. In 2002, the MEK told the world that the Iranians were building an enrichment plant, and that this plant was going to be used to produce material for nuclear weapons. So everyone, of course, quite rightly, really got very alarmed. But when the Atomic Energy Agency said to the Iranians, "Is this true?" The Iranians said, "Yes, it is absolutely true. We are building this plant, but we have every intention of submitting it to safeguards when it's completed, and we have absolutely no intention of using this plant to produce enriched uranium for weapons." That is a false allegation. And so it was there that when the plant was completed in 2003, it was declared, it was placed under safeguards, everything was in order. But at the same time, the Iranians decided to make a clean breast and to admit that they had been doing some things which were wrong. They had been conducting basic research into how to enrich uranium. They'd acquired some material, some nuclear material from China in 1991, which they'd never declared to the IEA. They should have declared it, but they hadn't. And then they'd used a small amount of that material to test some very sort of primitive centrifuge machines which they'd acquired from Pakistan. And they'd also used another bit of uranium to conduct research into what's known as laser enrichment. However, they made a clean breast of all of this, and they, having done so, they, if you like, came back into compliance with their safeguards